The crowd presses in around you, thousands of bodies filling the square, their voices rising like a tide. Above, 3 wooden beams reach toward the Tuscan sky. Below them, a mountain of kindling waits. The air smells of torch oil and sweat. Someone near you is weeping. Someone else is laughing. And then you see him, the man who once made this entire city tremble with nothing but words, being led up the scaffold in chains. His robes already stripped away, his face gaunt from weeks of torture. The same square where he burned paintings in silk, the same stones where he promised salvation. Now the fire is for him. Before we go deeper, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me every time that a story from 1498 can reach someone halfway across the globe. Centuries later, because we're all still asking the same question, what happens when someone dares to say the powerful are wrong? This is Florence, May 23rd, 1498. And the man about to die is Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who took on the Pope, reshaped an entire republic in the image of God's wrath, and paid for it with one of the most public executions Renaissance Italy ever witnessed. His death was not just punishment. It was theater, it was warning, and it was revenge. But to understand why they burned him, you have to go back 4 years earlier to the moment when Florence stopped being the city of art and became the city of fear. Savonarola didn't arrive in Florence as a conqueror. He came in 1482 as a preacher, thin and awkward, with a voice that cracked when he tried to shout. At first, no one paid attention. His sermons were long and clumsy. The elegant Florentines, used to the refined humanism of their golden age, found him unimpressive. But something shifted. By the early 1490s, his voice had changed, or maybe the city had. He no longer begged for attention. He seized it. Standing in the pulpit of San Marco, and later in the vast cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, Savonarola began to preach apocalypse. Not metaphor, not allegory. Literal divine punishment. He told Florence that God had seen their vanity, their greed, their silk-covered sins, and that a reckoning was coming. He spoke in images so vivid they left people shaking angels with flaming swords, rivers of blood, cities swallowed by earthquakes. And he named names. The Medici family, rulers of Florence, were tyrants. The Pope himself, Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was corrupt, a simoniac, unworthy of the throne of St. Peter. This was not careful politics. This was a man setting fire to the world with his tongue. And then, in 1494, his prophecy came true. Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with an army 25,000 strong, marching south like the wrath Savonarola had promised. The Medici, paralyzed by fear and poor decisions, fled Florence. In the chaos that followed, no duke or council stepped forward. Instead, the city turned to the friar who had predicted it all. Savonarola didn't take a crown. He didn't need one. He became the spiritual architect of what he called the New Jerusalem, a republic ruled not by wealth or lineage, but by the law of God. What followed was a transformation so extreme, it's hard to believe it happened in the cradle of the Renaissance. Taverns were raided. Gambling banned, women were told to cover themselves and abandon cosmetics. Carnival, once a week of music, wine, and wild celebration, became a season of repentance. And the children, organized into brigades Savonarola called the Fanciulli, roamed the streets, knocking on doors, demanding that citizens surrender their vanities. Books of poetry, playing cards, mirrors, paintings of classical myths, even works by Botticelli, one of the greatest artists of the age, were handed over. And then came the bonfire. February 7, 1497, Piazza della Signoria. In the center of the square, Savonarola's followers built a pyramid of wood 15 meters high. On it, they piled everything they had collected: silk dresses, wigs, perfumes, lutes, dice, manuscripts, art. Thousands gathered to watch. Hymns were sung, prayers chanted, and then the fire was lit. Flames climbed into the winter sky, devouring centuries of culture in hours. Witnesses said you could see the smoke from miles away. Some wept, others cheered. Savonarola stood watching, arms raised, declaring that Florence had been cleansed. But there was one man who did not applaud. One man whose rage was quietly building in Rome. Pope Alexander VI had tolerated the friars' earlier insults. But this public theocracy, this alternative vision of Christian authority, was a direct challenge to the Vatican itself. And Alexander was not a man who forgave. By 1497, the Pope's patience ran out. He issued a formal excommunication condemning Savonarola for heresy, disobedience, and schism. The document was explicit. Savonarola was no longer a priest. He was no longer part of the church. He was an enemy. Most men would have fallen silent. Savonarola kept preaching. He stood in the pulpit and declared the Pope's excommunication invalid. He said a corrupt shepherd had no authority over God's flock. He called Alexander a false pope, a wolf in holy robes. The crowds still came, but now they were nervous. Even his allies began to whisper, "He's gone too far." And Florence, exhausted by years of moral policing and economic stagnation, began to fracture. The merchants wanted their trade back. The artists wanted their freedom. The rival Franciscans wanted revenge. And the political elite wanted power. The breaking point came in April 1498. A Franciscan friar publicly challenged Savonarola to an ordeal by fire, a medieval test where a man walks through flames to prove God's favor. Savonarola's supporter, Fra Domenico, accepted on his behalf. Thousands gathered in Piazza della Signoria on April 7th. The stakes were built, the torches ready, and then it rained. A thunderstorm broke over Florence. Disputes erupted over who should enter the fire first, what prayers should be said, whether carrying a crucifix into the flames was allowed. Hours passed. The crowd grew restless. And then, without any fire being lit, the whole event was called off. The crowd exploded. To them, this was proof Savonarola's God had abandoned him. 3 days later, an armed mob stormed the convent of San Marco. Savonarola and 2 of his closest followers were dragged out and arrested. Now the city wanted blood. The friar was taken to the Palazzo della Signoria and locked in a cramped cell in the tower, the Albergatino, barely large enough to stand in. Florentine authorities and papal commissioners demanded a confession. Savonarola refused, so they turned to a tool as old as the Inquisition itself, the strapeta. His hands were tied behind his back. A rope was looped through a pulley high above, and then he was hoisted into the air and dropped. The sudden jerk dislocated his shoulders. The pain was unbearable. They did it again and again. Under this agony, Savonarola signed a confession. He admitted that his prophecies were invented, that his visions were false, that he had manipulated the people for political power. But when the torture stopped, he recanted. He said the confession had been forced, that he had only signed it to make the pain stop. The authorities tortured him again. He confessed again, then recanted again. This went on for weeks. Historians still debate what Savonarola truly believed in those final days. But the Florentine government didn't care about truth. They cared about control. They published edited versions of his confessions, distributed them across the city, and declared the matter settled. Savonarola was a fraud, a heretic, a liar. On May 23, 1498, sentence was carried out. The square was packed, the same place where the bonfire of the vanities had burned, the same stones where Savonarola had once stood as Florence's moral king. Now a scaffold stood there instead, 3 wooden gallows above a pyramid of kindling. Savonarola and his 2 companions, Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro, were led out in chains. Before the execution, they were subjected to one final humiliation, degradation, a church ritual designed to strip them not just of their robes, but of their souls. Bishop Francesco Remolino, the Papal commissioner, spoke the words slowly, deliberately, so the crowd could hear. "I separate thee from the church militant and the church triumphant." It meant they were cast out, not just from life, but from salvation. Then came the hanging. One by one, they were strung up by the neck, their bodies jerked, their legs kicked. And when the movement stopped, the executioners lit the pyre below. Flames roared upward. The bodies caught fire immediately. Clothes, skin, hair. The smell was overwhelming. Some in the crowd turned away. Others stared, transfixed. The fire burned for hours, consuming everything until only ash and bone remained. And even then, the authorities weren't finished. They gathered every fragment, every piece of charred wood, every scrap of cloth, and threw it all into the Arno River, ensuring that no relics could be taken, no martyrdom claimed. But they failed. Even as the ashes floated downstream, people in the crowd had already pocketed fragments, small pieces of burnt fabric, splinters of wood. They hid them, passed them on. To Savonarola's followers, he had not died a heretic. He had died a prophet, silenced by the corrupt powers he had dared to name. The Catholic Church made sure his name stayed condemned. His writings were banned, his followers persecuted. The Dominican order at San Marco was purged and restructured. Florence moved on, or tried to. The Medici eventually returned. The Renaissance continued. The bonfires stopped, and within a generation, Savonarola became a cautionary tale, whispered about but not celebrated. Yet something about his story refused to disappear. Centuries later, writers and reformers would return to him, some calling him a proto-Protestant, others a fanatic, still others a martyr who saw the rot in Rome before Luther ever nailed his theses to a door. Even now, historians argue over what he truly was: prophet or demagogue, reformer or tyrant, victim or architect of his own destruction. In Piazza della Signoria today, you can still find the spot where he burned. There's a small bronze plaque embedded in the stones, a simple circle marking the place. No monument, no statue, just stone and silence where a man once tried to remake the world and was destroyed for it. What do you do when the system itself is corrupt, when the very institution meant to represent justice or truth has become the thing that needs reform? Savonarola's answer was fire. He preached it, he practiced it, and in the end, he became it. His death didn't settle the question, it only made it louder, because the fire in Piazza della Signoria didn't just consume a man, it consumed an idea that moral authority could stand against political power, that prophecy could challenge corruption, that one voice could change a city. And Florence watched it all burn, not knowing whether they had executed a heretic or silenced a saint. The ashes drifted into the river. The crowd went home, and the question remained unanswered, floating in the smoke.